My name is Walter Crane, and I am 72 years old. I have spent my entire life working as a history teacher at the local high school, and for decades my days were filled with young voices, the smell of chalk dust, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that at least some of my students might one day remember a lesson or two, not so much from the textbook, but about how the past shapes us and how we repeat mistakes if we don't look back carefully enough. When my wife Margaret passed away 6 years ago, the house we had lived in together suddenly became unbearably large and echoing. Every room seemed haunted by her presence, and I could not walk through the hallway without hearing the soft creak of her slippers or see her knitting basket left by the couch, as if she might return any moment to pick it up again. For a long time, I lived in denial, pretending she was simply visiting her sister or away for a weekend. But silence is relentless, and in the end, I had to accept that the life we had built, with its laughter and small quarrels and morning rituals, had been cut short forever. It was my daughter, Claire, who insisted that I should not remain in that house any longer. She said that a man of my age should not live alone, that one accident, a fall on the stairs or a slip in the kitchen, could leave me helpless for hours before anyone found me. She told me that she and her husband Paul would gladly take me in, that there was plenty of space in their large suburban home, and that I would finally be surrounded by family instead of the loneliness. At first, I resisted. There was pride in me still, the pride of a man who had always provided, who had always paid his bills on time, who had never been late to work, who had raised a daughter to adulthood without letting her want for anything. But pride is a fragile armor when weighed against the constant ache of solitude. I gave in, thinking that perhaps this was the natural circle of life. The child grows, builds her own household, and eventually opens her doors to the parent who once opened the doors of his own home for her. When I moved into Claire's house, I was given a small room on the ground floor, close to the kitchen and the back door that led out into the yard. It was not grand, but to me, it became a sanctuary. I brought my old desk, the one on which I had graded thousands of papers through the years, its surface scarred with marks of fountain pens, coffee mugs, and restless tapping fingers. I placed my reading lamp there, along with a pile of books I had promised myself I would reread in retirement. On the walls, I hung photographs of Margaret, smiling on our honeymoon in Maine, holding Claire as a baby in her arms, sitting in the garden surrounded by roses she had planted herself. I even brought an old upholstered armchair that sagged in the middle, but had molded itself perfectly to my frame over time. That room, though small, became the last corner of the world where I felt like myself, not just a guest in someone else's house. In the mornings, when Claire and Paul rushed to work and the children hurried out with their backpacks swinging on their shoulders, I would sit by the small window in my room and watch the sunlight spread across the backyard. There was a large oak tree there, and I liked to see how the squirrels darted from branch to branch, while the wind shook loose leaves in great showers of color during autumn. Sometimes I would hear Margaret's voice in my head, soft and calm, telling me that this was exactly what we had dreamed of in old age: peace, books, and the warmth of family nearby. I clung to that thought, convincing myself that despite the inevitable discomfort of being dependent on my daughter, I was fortunate. After all, many men my age spend their final years in anonymous nursing homes, with strangers for caretakers. At least here I could smell the coffee brewing in the mornings, hear the laughter of my grandchildren upstairs, and feel as though life had not entirely cast me aside. Still, beneath that comfort, there was always a subtle unease. I noticed the way Paul sometimes looked at me when I entered the living room without knocking, as though I were intruding on a space that was no longer mine to claim. I noticed how Claire's voice, though affectionate, often carried a tone of mild impatience when I asked for small favors, driving me to the pharmacy, helping me with the online forms I could never quite master. She would smile and say, "Of course, Dad," but her eyes would flicker with the same restlessness I once saw in her as a teenager when she was eager to leave the house and meet friends. I told myself I was imagining it, that my grief had made me too sensitive, that every family has its moments of friction. I tried not to dwell on the little signs that perhaps my presence was less a joy for them than a burden accepted out of duty. To fight these thoughts, I filled my days with small routines. After breakfast, I would read the newspaper from beginning to end. Not just the headlines, but every article. Even the sports section I barely understood, simply to keep my mind engaged. I wrote long letters by hand, though I rarely sent them, pages of memories, reflections, sometimes addressed to Margaret as if she could still receive them. In the afternoons, I would walk slowly around the block with a cane, nodding to neighbors who mostly did not know my name. On good days, I took out my harmonica, the one I had played clumsily in my youth, and sat in my armchair trying to coax out tunes that were more breath than music. These were small, fragile attempts to remind myself that I still existed as a person, with habits, interests, and a history, not merely as Dad or Grandpa occupying the ground floor room. I told myself that Claire was right, that it was better to live under her roof than to cling stubbornly to an empty house filled with ghosts. I told myself that she loved me in her own brisk way, even if she no longer had the softness her mother once had, and that she was simply busy, juggling work and children and responsibilities that left little room for sentiment. I reminded myself that generations before me had done the same. Old parents folded quietly into the households of their children, grateful for a bed and a roof, asking for nothing more. Perhaps this was what dignity meant in old age. Not grand declarations, not independence at any cost, but the ability to accept one's shrinking place in the world with grace. And yet, as I sat in my room at night, listening to the muffled sounds of the family above me, I often felt like a man standing at the edge of a stage after the play had ended, watching the actors remove their costumes and step into the lights of a world where he no longer belonged. My room was my refuge, my last little kingdom, and I guarded it fiercely, for in that small space lay all that remained of my identity. The books, the photographs, the memories of a marriage that had defined me, and the dignity of still being able to close the door and know that behind it I was still myself. The day that shifted everything began in the most ordinary manner, which is perhaps why it unsettled me so deeply when I finally realized what had been done. That morning I had gone for a slow walk to the small park 3 streets over, leaning heavily on my cane, but still taking satisfaction in the crisp air and the sound of leaves being raked by neighbors. I remember greeting a woman walking her dog and pausing for several minutes to watch children clamber on the swings. By the time I returned, the sun was already low, casting a golden haze across the neighborhood, and I felt tired but content in that quiet way an old man does after completing a small but meaningful effort. I pushed open the door to the house and called out a soft greeting, expecting perhaps to hear Claire's voice from the kitchen or the familiar noise of my grandchildren's music drifting down from upstairs. Instead, the house was oddly hushed, and when I walked toward my room, I immediately sensed that something was wrong, though I could not have explained why at that instant. The door stood open, which was unusual, since I always closed it when I left. Not because I had secrets to protect, but because I cherished the notion of boundaries, of having one space where my presence lingered, even in absence. I stepped into the room and froze. The desk, the armchair, the shelves, even the framed photographs of Margaret that had hung on the walls, everything was gone. The room had been emptied so thoroughly that it seemed as if I had never lived there at all. Against the far wall stood a row of shiny racks gleaming under the ceiling light, and on them hung Claire's dresses, blouses, and coats in neat rows, sorted by color and fabric. Boxes of shoes were stacked where my books had once been, and a large mirror leaned against the wall, reflecting not my belongings, but a curated display of my daughter's possessions. For several moments I simply stood there, my breath catching in my throat, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. It was as if my existence had been erased with ruthless efficiency, replaced by satin and leather, by handbags and scarves, as though clothing had more right to the space than the man who had spent months building his refuge here. I looked around for my things and finally noticed several cardboard boxes pushed into a corner, half sealed with tape, with my name scrawled in thick black marker across the top. Inside one box, I glimpsed the edge of Margaret's photograph frame, wrapped clumsily in newspaper, and I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to steady myself against the wall. At that moment, Claire walked in, holding a pile of folded sweaters in her arms. She saw me standing in the doorway and gave me a smile that was meant to be casual, but seemed too rehearsed. "Oh, Dad, you're back. I was just finishing up. Don't look so shocked. It's not a big deal. We thought this would be more practical." I stared at her, unable to speak, and she set the sweaters down on one of the racks before continuing, her tone light, almost cheerful, as though explaining something obvious to a child. "You see, the room was small, and it didn't make sense for you to be stuck in here all day when we could just set you up in the living room. It has more light, more space, and you'll be closer to everyone instead of tucked away." Her words struck me like cold water. She had said it as though it were a gift, as though banishing me from the one place I could call my own was some benevolent gesture. I finally found my voice and asked, though it trembled with suppressed anger, "Where are my things, Claire?" She gestured vaguely toward the boxes, brushing off the question as if it were trivial. "Everything's right there. We kept it all safe. Don't worry. You can go through them later and decide what you want to keep. Maybe some of those old books could go to the library sale, and the rest of the stuff, well, we'll find a place for it." No sense in cluttering up the house. The casual dismissal in her tone cut deeper than if she had shouted at me. I walked slowly to the nearest box and opened it, seeing Margaret's smiling face peering at me from behind the glass of the frame, stuffed between an old cardigan and a stack of letters tied with ribbon. My hand shook as I lifted the photograph out and wiped away a smudge of newsprint. That picture had hung above my desk since the day we moved into our first home, and now it lay crumpled like any other object without meaning. I turned to Claire, my voice low and unsteady. This was my room. This was where I lived. She sighed, as though my protest were nothing more than stubbornness. "Dad, don't be dramatic. You'll be more comfortable in the living room. We put the couch near the window, and there's even a little table where you can keep your lamp. You'll see, it's nice. And besides, Paul and I really needed the storage space. You know how many clothes and shoes we have, and the closets upstairs are just too small. This works out better for everyone." I wanted to shout, to tell her that my life, my memories, my dignity were not items that could be folded into boxes and pushed aside to make room for handbags, but the words stuck in my throat, and all I managed was a choked whisper, "Better for everyone but me." She tilted her head, giving me that same look she used to give as a teenager when she believed I was being unreasonable. "Don't take it so personally. You still have the whole house. The living room is bigger than this anyway, and think of it. You'll be at the center of things, instead of hidden away." Then she gave me a quick peck on the cheek, turned back to the racks of clothes, and began arranging her sweaters, humming softly as though the matter were settled beyond appeal. I left the room slowly, carrying Margaret's photograph in my hands like a relic. When I reached the living room, I saw what she had meant. The couch had been pulled out into a makeshift bed, with a blanket folded neatly at the end and a small table shoved against the wall. My lamp sat there, along with one of the cardboard boxes, as though this cramped corner in a shared space could serve as my new home. The television dominated the room, and the noise of children's shows already floated from it. This was no refuge, no sanctuary. It was a public stage where my every cough and sigh would be heard, where I would have no door to close, no privacy to retreat to when the world felt too heavy. As I stood there, Paul entered, glancing at me briefly, before announcing in a tone that brooked no discussion, "This arrangement makes sense, Walter. We needed the extra closet space, and you'll be more comfortable here. It's easier for you, really." He did not wait for my response, but went to the kitchen to grab a drink, leaving me with the bitter taste of humiliation pressing down on my chest. For the first time since moving into their house, I felt not like a guest or even a tolerated relative, but like an object being shifted from one corner to another to make room for what they valued more. That night, lying on the couch with the glow of the television still flickering in the dark because my grandchildren had left it on upstairs, I held Margaret's photograph to my chest and realized with painful clarity that something had changed forever. The room that had once held my life had been erased in an afternoon, converted into a closet without hesitation or apology. My daughter's voice echoed in my ears. "Don't be dramatic, Dad." And I understood that in her eyes my needs, my identity, my very presence had become smaller than a stack of clothes. What unsettled me most was not the loss of walls and furniture, but the revelation of how little space I truly occupied in their hearts. The first days after I was pushed from my room into the living room were marked by a kind of numb disbelief, as though I were moving through a fog that dulled the sharp edges of what had happened. But soon the reality of my new position settled on me with its full weight. My corner by the window, with the couch and the little table, was not a room at all but a makeshift station, a temporary perch that signaled to everyone in the household that I was no longer entitled to privacy or respect. I noticed how quickly the family adapted to my displacement. At breakfast, when I lingered with my coffee at the table, my grandson Mark would snicker as he passed by, pointing at the couch and saying to his sister, "Look, Grandpa's room is the TV room now. Maybe he'll start charging rent." They laughed, not cruelly in the way children sometimes are, but with a casual indifference that revealed how normal my humiliation had already become to them. At night, I struggled to sleep with the hum of appliances, the distant sound of Paul's late-night television upstairs, and the inevitable interruptions when one of the children padded down to the kitchen for a glass of milk, flicking on the light that shone directly onto my couch. More than once, I woke to find one of them rummaging through the cupboard only a few feet away, glancing at me with a half-smile, as though it were amusing to find their grandfather laid out there like a boarder in a hostel. On one particularly bitter evening, Mark remarked with a grin that I lived in the closet now, and though Claire hushed him quickly, I saw the corners of Paul's mouth twitch in amusement. That moment branded itself into my mind, because it confirmed that my new situation was not a misunderstanding, but an arrangement tacitly approved by them all. The boxes of my belongings remained stacked in the garage, collecting dust, because Claire kept postponing the task of sorting through them. Each time I asked if I could bring my desk back, or at least set up a small shelf for my books, she responded with the same irritated patience one reserves for a child's repeated question. "Dad, we'll get to it, but the garage is already crowded." "You don't need all those things anyway. You never read half those books." I wanted to protest that those books had been my companions for decades, that each one carried notes in the margins and memories of the evenings Margaret and I spent reading together, but the words seemed powerless against her tone of finality, so I swallowed them, though they burned in my throat like ashes. It was Paul, however, who sharpened my sense of displacement into something unbearable. He began to speak about me in the third person, even when I was in the room, as though I were furniture rather than family. "Claire, did your father take his pills today?" he would ask, glancing at the pill organizer that she had set on the counter, even though I had never once missed a dose in my life. "Claire, is your dad eating enough vegetables? He looks pale." Each comment chipped away at me, reducing me to a caricature of a frail dependent who needed supervision. Once, when I reached for the remote control to lower the volume of the blaring television, he chuckled and said, "Careful, Walter. Don't get confused by all those buttons." The children laughed, and I sat frozen, humiliated by the suggestion that I could not even manage such a trivial task. The worst moments came during family gatherings when neighbors or friends stopped by. On those occasions, Claire would retell little stories about me that twisted ordinary mishaps into tales of forgetfulness, painting me as absent-minded and doddering. "Dad almost left the kettle on yesterday," she would say with a bright smile, though in truth I had merely stepped away for a moment before returning to switch it off. "We have to keep an eye on him, but he's doing okay." Laughter would ripple through the room, and I would force a smile, knowing that any protest would only make me appear defensive, perhaps even confirming their perception of me as confused. Inside, though, I seethed with a humiliation so sharp it left me trembling long after the guests had gone. One afternoon, determined to reclaim some piece of dignity, I decided to unpack one of my boxes. I carried it from the garage into the living room and began sorting through the contents, laying out Margaret's photographs, my notebooks, and several cherished volumes of history that had once lined my shelves. Claire walked in midway through and stopped, her smile tightening. "Dad, what are you doing? You can't just scatter things around here. The kids need this space." "We have guests coming tonight." I explained that I needed some of my belongings close at hand, that these objects were not just clutter, but fragments of my life, but she shook her head firmly. "We'll keep everything safe in the garage. This area has to stay clear." She began repacking the box right in front of me, sliding my books back into it with brisk efficiency. And though I wanted to reach out and stop her, my hands remained limp in my lap, weighted by the knowledge that arguing would change nothing. That evening, lying once again on the couch with the smell of dinner lingering in the air, I thought about how easily my daughter had brushed aside my protests, how quickly she had learned to treat my history as disposable. I realized with a cold clarity that my presence in her house had shifted from being a father to being a tolerated object, a piece of background furniture that could be moved, silenced, or ignored as convenience dictated. The humiliation was no longer occasional. It was a steady current running through each day, a quiet but relentless erosion of my dignity. What struck me most painfully was the way my grandchildren mirrored their parents' behavior, absorbing without question the subtle cues that my words carried less weight, that my wishes mattered less. When I asked them to lower their voices late at night because I was trying to sleep on the couch, they rolled their eyes and muttered, "Grandpa's cranky again." When I offered to help with homework, they shrugged me off, saying that I probably didn't understand the new methods anyway. Each small rejection was a stone added to the pile on my chest, pressing me down further into silence. In those days, I began to feel that my identity itself was dissolving, that the man who had once lectured classrooms of students, who had managed finances, repaired household problems, and been the steady partner to a wife for 40 years, had been reduced to a frail figure shuffling from couch to kitchen, dependent on the goodwill of others. It terrified me because I sensed that once others perceive you as diminished, it becomes dangerously easy for them to treat you as less than fully human. And though I did not yet know the full extent of Claire and Paul's intentions, I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, carrying me towards something darker than mere neglect. The breaking point arrived not with shouting or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet rustle of papers slid across the kitchen table one Saturday morning. I had been drinking my coffee slowly, savoring the small comfort of its warmth in my hands, when Claire came in, carrying a neat folder. She wore the expression of brisk efficiency that I remembered from her school days when she prepared presentations for class projects. Except now the stakes were different, and the careful cheer in her voice immediately put me on guard. She sat down opposite me, opened the folder, and said, "Dad, we just need you to sign a few things. It's nothing complicated, just paperwork that will make it easier for us to manage things for you." I looked at the neatly printed form she slid across the table. The language of legal offices dense with words that seemed familiar, yet unsettling. Power of attorney, transfer of authority, management of financial assets. For a moment, I could not believe what I was seeing. I asked her calmly why she thought I needed someone to manage my affairs. She replied with a mixture of patience and condescension that made my stomach twist. "Dad, you've had a few slip-ups lately. You almost lost your wallet last week, remember? And you get tired so easily. Paul and I just want to make sure everything is safe and secure for you. This way we can pay bills on time, keep track of your insurance, all those little things that can be overwhelming." I wanted to tell her that I had managed those so-called little things for over 70 years, that I had balanced budgets for our household, guided students through complex research projects, paid mortgages and hospital bills without ever missing a deadline. But when I opened my mouth, the words came out as a shaky protest. "I can still take care of myself, Claire." She reached across the table and patted my hand, in that falsely soothing way people use with children or patients. "Of course you can, Dad. But think of this as just an extra layer of support. It will relieve you of the burden." The folder remained in front of me like a trap disguised as a gift. I felt heat rising in my chest, the awareness that once my signature marked those pages, I would no longer control my own life. I asked her what would happen if I chose not to sign, and her eyes flickered, a small shadow passing through the mask of cheerfulness. "Well, Dad, we'd have to look into other arrangements, maybe professional help. I just don't want things to get complicated." Later that day, while I was sitting alone in the living room, I overheard voices drifting down from the upstairs hallway. The door was half open, and their words carried clearly. Paul's voice, sharp and pragmatic, said, "He's resisting, but we can push him. Once he's on board, we can move forward with selling the property. The lot alone is worth a fortune, and that money would give us the cushion we need for the business. He won't need it where he's going." Claire's reply was quieter, tinged with uncertainty, but still complicit. "I know, but it feels cruel. He's my father." Paul cut her off. "Stop thinking like that. It's not cruel. It's practical. He's old, and we can't let sentiment get in the way. Do you want to keep struggling forever, or do you want a future for us and the kids?" I sat frozen, every syllable pressing into me like a blade. They were not speaking about my comfort or my safety. They were plotting to strip me of control, to tuck me away somewhere convenient while they harvested the life I had built. In that moment, the fog of self-doubt that had plagued me cleared, and I saw with painful clarity that my humiliation had not been a series of careless oversights, but part of a deliberate pattern. The couch in the living room, the jokes about my forgetfulness, the forms pushed across the table, these were steps in a plan designed to reduce me, until I was nothing more than an obstacle to be managed. I returned to my couch that night with Margaret's photograph pressed against my chest, staring into the shadows as the house settled into sleep around me. I thought of the decades I had spent providing, of the countless evenings when Margaret and I had discussed what we might leave behind for Claire. The small savings, the modest house, the hope that our daughter would use them wisely. To discover now that she saw me not as a father to be cherished in his last years, but as a ledger of assets to be liquidated, was a cruelty I could never have imagined when we cradled her as a baby. My hands trembled as I realized that the walls around me were not protection, but prison bars. that the family I had trusted to shelter me was preparing to erase me entirely. That night I made a silent vow. I would not sign away my life, and I would not let them dictate how my final years were to be lived. In the days that followed the papers on the kitchen table, the house seemed to tilt on its axis in a way that was imperceptible to anyone not living at my height, which is to say at the level of a couch and a low lamp and a small table where I kept my glasses. And I began to notice how routines were rearranged with gentle firmness until they no longer served me, but instead served a plan I could now feel pulsing beneath the surface of every conversation. Because Claire and Paul no longer bothered to hide the impatience that sped through their voices whenever I asked for time to consider things, nor did they disguise the relief that washed across their faces when I said little and looked down at my hands as if accepting a verdict I had not heard read aloud. Claire started intercepting the mail under the pretext of helping me sort the important from the junk, and in her hands bills and statements disappeared into folders that were never left within my reach, while appointment cards to doctors I had not, and asked to see, appeared mysteriously on the counter, alongside notes in her brisk handwriting reminding me that it's best to be proactive, and I watched as tiny pieces of my independence were collected like buttons from an old coat, tucked into a jar, and set on a high shelf. The first real blow landed one afternoon when I found that the pill organizer, which I had kept on a particular corner of the kitchen counter for as long as I had lived there, had been moved into a locked cabinet near the pantry with a key that Claire wore as casually as a charm on her bracelet, and when I asked why, she smiled the way nurses smile in hospital corridors, explaining that the grandchildren might get into it, although they had never shown the slightest interest in my medications, and then she added that she had revised my dosages after consulting with a doctor who turned out to be a friend of Paul's from his gym, a physician who would later take my blood pressure while never meeting my eyes, who would address me as sir in the tone one uses for a bothersome customer, and who asked questions that sounded less like medical inquiry and more like a script designed to prod me into small confusions, such as the date of last Thursday or the name of the current governor, things I knew perfectly well until the room filled with the heat of my humiliation and my mind seized with the fear of performing poorly in front of hostile witnesses. I understood, as I answered with a stammer and watched Paul exchange quick looks with his friend, that what they sought was not my health, but a phrase on a form, a phrase that could be quoted later, perhaps in court, perhaps in a bank, perhaps in the office of some administrator at a place with soft chairs and heavy curtains where people go to disappear. The next blow came wrapped in the tissue of charity when Claire announced that she had donated a few of my old things because the house was cluttered and because it would do me good, in her words, to travel lighter. And only later did I discover, in the hollow quiet of the garage, that one of the boxes she had given away contained Margaret's old winter coat with the fur collar still smelling faintly of her perfume, and beneath it a dress wrapped in blue paper that I recognized even through my banchos. Shock. The dress she wore on our 40th anniversary, when the restaurant band played a slow waltz, and the waiter brought us a cake with candles shaped like numbers. And I stood there among the plastic bins and rakes with the sharp feeling that someone had quietly cut a string that held my life together, because the dress was not merely fabric, it was an archive of warmth and memory. And it was gone, passed into the hands of strangers who would never know how carefully Margaret had folded it. How often I had seen her smile when she opened the box to show it to Claire, telling her stories about that night as if lighting a lantern against forgetting. When I confronted my daughter, she claimed it had been an accident, that she had not realized what was in the box, that perhaps the charity shop still had it if we hurried, and we did hurry, and we did not find it. And Paul, who drove us there with the irritation of a man losing a Saturday to a task he considered beneath him, barked that all of this nonsense proved exactly why decisions should not be left to me, why adult supervision was necessary. And in the silence of the ride home, I understood that they believed they had discovered my price, which was grief. The house itself cooperated with the new order, or at least that is how it felt when Claire began installing little control measures that she described as safety features, devices that beeped if the back door was opened, cameras that watched the front entryway and the living room in wide angles she assured me were just for security, and a scheduling board posted on the refrigerator that mapped my week with the tidy discipline of a classroom chart, colored magnets marking walks, meals, appointments, rest, and family time, which sounded generous until I realized it meant that my ability to step into the yard for air was now a box to be checked, my coffee a permission to be granted, my visits to the library downgraded from pleasure to risk, especially after she insisted on driving me there for convenience, parked, and then suggested that we simply browse quickly because she had so much to do. And in 10 minutes I was hustled back out without the book I wanted, while my arm was gripped with the gentle but insistent pressure reserved for toddlers in parking lots. I began to notice the stealthy way they corrected my narratives, too. If I mentioned that I intended to call an old colleague to have lunch, Claire would answer that I had already called him last week, and he was busy, which confused me because I had no memory of such a call. And later when I found my address book missing and the numbers on my phone mysteriously trimmed, I saw that the isolation I had felt creeping in from the edges was not a symptom of age, but an instrument wielded with mild voices and bright smiles. What revealed their motive with the hard clarity of a noon light was a conversation that was not meant for me, a conversation that bled down the stairwell one evening when they forgot how sound travels in houses built of wood and shared air. Paul spoke first, agitated, providing figures that marched like soldiers. The line of credit on the business was close to its limit. The loan he had secured against their car had a balloon payment. The investor he had bragged about at dinner had not materialized, and the only substantial asset within reach was the parcel of land attached to my name. A small but valuable lot that came with the last piece of property Margaret and I had sold years ago, a detail I had foolishly explained to Claire when I moved in, thinking a daughter had a right to know the family's modest holdings. Claire, tired and defensive, argued that there must be another way, that perhaps they could consolidate, that perhaps overtime at her office would ease the strain. But Paul cut through her hesitation like a blade, reminding her that the children needed braces and summer programs and college savings, and that while he respected her softness would not keep the business alive or the house out of foreclosure. And if that meant moving me into a place better suited to his needs, then it was, in his favorite word, only practical. The practicalities fell upon me like hailstones. The appointment with a neuropsychologist scheduled at 8 a.m. in a clinic, a county away where the receptionist handed me a pen and a sheaf of tests designed to make any elderly person stumble with their mazes and scatterings of numbers and word lists delivered too quickly by a young woman who had never heard the name of the battles I used to teach, and who smiled with frozen sympathy when I hesitated, as if hesitation were itself a confession. The visit to the bank where Claire insisted I come along to update your contact information, which turned out to mean placing her as the primary point of contact and requesting duplicate statements forwarded to an email address I did not control. The visit from a social worker who introduced herself softly and asked whether I ever felt unsafe, and when I said no, because fear was not the right word, and because my pride would not allow me to confess what sounded so pitiful, she nodded and made notes that I could not read upside down, and I watched Paul leaning in the doorway with an expression of attentive cooperation that would have impressed any jury, a man ready to do what's best. The children, who had once rolled their eyes at me with the harmless arrogance of youth, learned a crueler game by imitation, and they began to stage small experiments in front of me, switching the placement of items on my small table, and then asking if I was sure that I had left my glasses there, hiding the remote and then calling out for me to find it, while they timed me, insisting that I had promised to take them to the park at a certain hour when I had said no such thing, so that they could chorus in mock disappointment that Grandpa forgot again. And through it all, Claire would correct them with a tone too light to be effective, and then would catch my eye with a look that seemed to say that this too proved her point, that the household could no longer be held hostage to my limitations, which were not limitations so much as bruises delivered in plain sight of my family. When I objected, when I raised my voice and told them sharply to stop, the room would go quiet in that dangerous way rooms do when the next line in the script is already known, and Paul would step in with his hands lifted in a pantomime of calm, telling me that there was no need to get agitated, that agitation elevated blood pressure, that it would be better for everyone if I let others handle the complicated things. One morning, Paul suggested a drive to get some fresh air, which sounded harmless enough, and I agreed because the house had begun to feel like a padded cell. And we drove for 40 minutes past the edge of town to a place with clean sidewalks and tidy shrubs where a sign announced the name of a residence in tasteful font. And it was only when we were buzzed in and a woman at a desk asked for my insurance information, while Paul filled out a clipboard, that I understood this was not a tour, but an intake, and I felt the heat rise from my collar to my scalp as I set the pen down and said very quietly that I was not staying. Not today, not ever. And the woman's smile slipped a fraction, and Paul's hand tightened briefly on my shoulder before he plastered on his salesman's grin and told her that we would return with the rest of the documents. And as we left, he scolded me in the car with a fury that rode just beneath his tone, accusing me of embarrassing him, of making Claire's life harder, of failing to be reasonable. And in that long ride home, I thought about every student I had ever taught who had come from a house where anger lived in the walls. And I wondered how many of their grandparents had sat silently in back seats, while someone explained that the future would be arranged without their consent. I began to keep a small notebook, a habit I had not needed since my teaching days. And in it I recorded dates, words, incidents, the exact phrasing of Paul's insistence that he won't need it where he's going, the time Claire began opening the envelopes from the pension office before handing me the relevant pages, the day the charity shop called back to say a man had taken the blue dress 5 minutes after we left, the serial number of the camera that blinked red in the corner of the living room every time I moved in my sleep, because I understood at last that memory was the weapon they hoped to strip from me, and that the daily erasures had to be met with ink and clarity. No matter how my hand cramped, no matter how many times I had to squint to fit a line between two others when the day ran longer than the space on the page allowed. In those pages, I also wrote the names of people they could not touch, men and women I had known for decades who might remember me as more than an old man on a couch, and I imagined calling them and asking for an afternoon of their time. And I imagined showing up somewhere beyond the radius of this house's cameras to sit across from someone who still spoke my language, someone who might help me build a plan that was not made of resignation. The final strike of this phase, the one that sent me past dread into resolve, arrived the night I found that Margaret's photograph, the same one I had carried into the living room the day my room was turned into a closet, was missing from my small table. And after searching the cushions and the bookshelf and even the pockets of my coat, I went into the converted closet room and stood there beneath the mirror that now reflected rows of dresses where my books had once lived. And I asked Claire if she had seen the photograph, and she sighed the sigh of the long-suffering and told me she had placed it in a drawer because the frame was old and the backing loose, and it might fall and break. And when I opened the drawer and saw my wife's face, covered by a plastic bag filled with scarves, I felt something in me snap with a quiet that startled me. Because I did not shout, I did not weep, I simply lifted the photograph and wiped away the faint imprint the plastic had left on the glass. And I said in a level voice that carried down the hall like a bell that I would not be signing any papers. Not now, not later, not ever, and that I would be arranging my own affairs from this point forward. And Claire laughed in disbelief before she realized I was not employing the pleading tone she had trained me to use. And in that moment of pause, I recognized the small but vital leverage one gains when he stops asking permission to be himself. That night I did not sleep much, not because the house was loud or the couch uncomfortable, but because for the first time in months my mind ran not in circles of what-ifs, but in lines that led outward. And I thought about the quiet dignity with which Margaret faced every hard year. The way she had taught students to read difficult texts by tracing a path with her finger and saying that there is always a sentence that unlocks the paragraph if you look long enough. And I asked myself, what sentence would unlock this house? And I realized that it would begin with a call placed in the morning from a phone that was not mine to a number that had not been trimmed from memory. And it would continue with a meeting in an office where the smell of leather and paper still meant something real. And it would end with my name where it belonged, not beneath anyone else's signature, but beside it as an equal, and perhaps even above it. And in that long insomniac dawn, I understood that the second escalation was not merely theirs, that it could be mine too, and that the next move would not be a protest or a plea, but an action, deliberate and quiet. The kind of action that closes one future and opens another. I had reached a point where silence was no longer an option, because silence had already cost me too much. My room, my dignity, my memories, and nearly my identity itself. The night I decided to act, I sat with the notebook I had been keeping, its pages filled with the words and dates and phrases that proved my mind was not failing but alert. And I reread every entry like a soldier inspecting his ammunition before a final stand. For months I had been pressed into a corner of my own life, but now the pressure turned into something else. A hard resolve that made my hands steady as I packed Margaret's photograph, the notebook, and the documents my old friend, the lawyer, had given me into a worn leather satchel. At dawn, I left the house quietly before Claire or Paul stirred, because I did not want another scene in the kitchen where my protests were swallowed by their patronizing smiles. I walked to the bus station, boarded the early line into town, and felt with each passing mile that I was stepping out of a fog and into a reality where I could still choose the direction of my life. At the lawyer's office, the sunlight spilled across polished wood, and for the first time in years I felt that the room respected me. He greeted me not with the cautious tone reserved for the elderly, but with the professional directness he had always shown back when we were both younger men. I laid the notebook on his desk, opened to the page where I had copied in exact words the conversations I had overheard between Claire and Paul about selling my land and putting me into a nursing home. Then I showed him the folder Claire had wanted me to sign, the so-called support documents that in truth were papers transferring power of attorney. His eyes darkened as he read, and when he looked up, there was no pity in his gaze, only recognition that I was still capable of fighting back. "We'll draft a new will," he said, "and we'll do it today. They believe they hold the future in their hands, but that future belongs to you alone." By the time I left his office, the course of my life had been altered with the stroke of a pen. The will now transferred everything, my land, my accounts, the remainder of my possessions, not to Claire, but to a scholarship fund in Margaret's name at the college where I had once taught. Students with nothing, as we had once had nothing, would build their lives with the resources my daughter had tried to seize. To Claire, I left $1, and beside that line I signed my name with a steady hand, as though it were not just ink but a verdict. I returned home with a calmness that surprised me. They thought they were leading me toward a cage, but in truth I had already walked out of it, and now I only had to wait for the moment when they would realize the door had shut on them instead. That moment came sooner than I expected. One evening after dinner, Claire brought out the folder again, this time with Paul standing behind her, his arms folded, his presence intended as reinforcement. She smiled the smile that had grown more brittle with each passing week. "Dad, we need you to sign these tonight. It's for your own good. We can't keep putting this off." I looked at the folder, then at the two of them, and felt a strange pity. They were so certain of victory, so blind to the fact that the ground beneath their feet had already shifted. Instead of answering, I stood and fetched my satchel. I placed Margaret's photograph on the table first, letting the silence hang, and then I laid down the sealed copy of my new will. "You've already taken my room, my books, my privacy," I said slowly, "but you will not take the rest of my life. You wanted my future, but I have already closed that door to you." Their expressions faltered, confusion giving way to unease as I continued. "Every account, every piece of land, every decision you thought would fall into your hands is gone. I gave it to people who will honor it, not exploit it. And you, Claire, my only daughter, will inherit nothing but $1 and the memory of what you have done." The color drained from her face as Paul stepped forward, sputtering with anger, calling me foolish, ungrateful, senile. But the words no longer struck me as they once had. They fell harmless, because I had reclaimed the one thing they could not touch, my authority over my own life. I held up the notebook, page after page of dates and phrases in my careful hand. "This," I said, "is the record of your lies, your manipulations, your plan to erase me. If you try to contest what I have done, this will become public record, and so will your shame." Paul's jaw worked, but no words came. Claire sank into a chair, her hands shaking, whispering, "You can't do this." But I had already done it. I walked back to the couch that had been my cell and sat down with Margaret's photograph in my lap. Not as a prisoner, but as a man who had chosen his final battlefield and won. For the first time since she died, I felt I had honored her memory properly, not by clinging to the scraps of space they allowed me, but by standing up for the dignity she had always believed I possessed. My daughter's future, the one she had planned to build on my erasure, was closed by my hand. The days after my declaration settled over the house like an unexpected frost, silencing the usual bustle, muting the tones of conversation, and forcing everyone to move as though careful not to shatter the fragile surface of something new. Claire avoided me, her footsteps retreating whenever I entered a room, her voice reduced to clipped phrases about dinner times or errands, no longer laced with the false brightness she once used to disguise her intentions. Paul tried bluster, muttering about legal challenges, about foolish decisions, about how no court would honor the changes I had made. But his words were more for his own reassurance than for my intimidation, and I watched the fire drain from him each time. I merely looked at the notebook on my table, or the envelope from the lawyer bearing the embossed seal that confirmed the reality they could not undo. Even the children, who had once laughed at my expense, sensed the shift. Their mockery stopped, replaced by uneasy glances as if they had discovered that the old man on the couch was not quite as powerless as they had believed. For myself, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and release, as though I had buried not just Margaret long ago, But now the last illusions I had about the family I once thought would cradle me in my decline. I grieved the daughter I remembered, the small girl who once clung to my hand as we crossed streets, who ran to me with scraped knees and whispered fears, the young woman who smiled proudly when she graduated, believing her parents' sacrifices were gifts she would treasure forever. That daughter no longer lived in this house, or perhaps she had been consumed by years of compromises, by the sharp edge of Paul's ambitions, by the weight of debts and disappointments that reshaped her into someone who measured her father not by love but by ledger. It would have been easier to hate her, but hatred requires fire. And what I felt now was a cool acceptance, like water closing over a stone, that would remain buried but unbroken beneath the current. In the weeks that followed, I began to reclaim small rituals that steadied me. I read again at my own pace, not worrying whether the books cluttered the table. I wrote longer entries in my notebook, no longer only a record of offenses, but reflections on what it means to hold on to dignity when those closest to you try to strip it away. Sometimes I walked to the park and sat watching the children of strangers play, and in their laughter I found a bittersweet comfort, proof that innocence still existed somewhere, even if it had fled my own household. I even took my harmonica once more into my hands, breathing out clumsy notes that wavered yet held a purity of sound. And for a moment I felt Margaret beside me, reminding me that endurance itself can be music. Claire has not forgiven me, though in truth there is nothing for me to forgive. Our conversations are thin, stretched taut like wires that could snap at any word, and I know that the bond between us may never mend. But I have stopped longing for reconciliation. Instead, I have accepted that my final years will not be measured by her approval, but by the peace I carve out for myself within the boundaries of my own will. I have secured that will not just on paper, but within my heart, where no signature can be erased. She may resent me. She may weep in frustration at what she has lost. She may curse me in her thoughts. But one day, when I am gone, she will stand before the executor of my estate and hear the truth of what her choices cost her. And in that moment, perhaps she will understand, or perhaps she will not. Either way, justice will have been done. I sometimes imagine the students who will benefit from Margaret's scholarship, faces I will never know. Young people who may sit in libraries late at night with stacks of books, whispering prayers of gratitude to a benefactor whose name they cannot picture. That thought consoles me. It means my life's work will continue not as an inheritance devoured by greed, but as a seed planted in soil beyond the reach of betrayal. Perhaps that is the truest legacy a man can leave. Not wealth handed down to those who squander love, but opportunity passed to those who need it. In that vision, I find a quiet pride that steadies me more than any hollow affection in this house could. Now, each evening as the sun sinks behind the oak tree in the yard, I sit with Margaret's photograph on the table beside me and feel a measure of calm. I speak to her sometimes in whispers, telling her that I did not falter, that I kept faith with the dignity we built together, that though the circle of family closed against me, I broke it open and let the light fall elsewhere. And when sleep comes at last, I no longer dream of being trapped in rooms stripped bare of my presence. Instead, I dream of open windows, of the sound of pages turning, of the laughter of strangers who do not know my name, yet carry a fragment of my life forward. I do not know how long I will remain in this house, nor do I know if Claire will one day soften or if Paul will abandon his calculations, but I no longer measure my days by their moods. The true reckoning has already passed. The future they sought to claim has been closed to them, and the dignity they thought to bury has risen instead like iron in my spine. What remains for me now is simply to live as I am, unmasked, unbowed, and unafraid.